He never expected his peaceful evening at Murphy's Tavern in coastal Newport to expose a deadly human trafficking ring operating through the eastern seaboard. But when 3 drunk members of the Rising Tide rebels decided to harass the elderly man at the end of the bar, they had no idea they were messing with one of World War II's most decorated combat heroes and former Special Operations executive operative. The late autumn wind swept through Newport's harbour district, carrying the salt-laden scent of the Atlantic as Thomas Sullivan's weathered frame occupied his usual spot at Murphy's Tavern. At 97, his movements were deliberate as he nursed his customary glass of Jameson, each motion precise despite his advanced age. The evening regulars were already settling in, creating the familiar ambience that had drawn him to this establishment. For the past 5 decades, since returning home from a classified government position overseas. Margaret O'Brien, 75, and sharp as a tack, watched him from behind the bar, noting how he arranged his glass and coaster with military precision. Though she didn't know that's what it was. To her and everyone else in Newport, he was just the quiet widower who lived in the old Victorian house on Maple Street, the one who attended every Memorial Day service but never spoke about his service. "The weather's turning cold early this year, Tom," Margaret commented, wiping down the already spotless bar top. Her keen eyes noticed how he scanned the room with each new arrival, a habit she'd attributed to elderly caution rather than decades of trained vigilance. "Winters always come early to Newport," Thomas replied, his thick Irish accent softened by years in America. His gnarled fingers, surprisingly steady, lifted the glass with practiced grace. Behind his casual demeanor, his mind catalogued every detail of his surroundings, the positions of the patrons, the sightlines to all exits, the multiple routes to and from his position. Old habits died hard. His secure phone vibrated in his pocket, a specialized model disguised as an outdated flip phone. The message was brief, package moving through Newport. 24 hours. Thomas deleted it immediately, his expression never changing as he continued his conversation with Margaret about the upcoming storm season. The first sounds of trouble echoed from the street at 9:17 p.m. Thomas recognized the pattern. Multiple motorcycles, modified exhausts, the distinctive rumble of American-made machines. The Rising Tide rebels were early today. Usually they didn't make their presence known until the bars were fuller. Margaret tensed at the sound. "Oh dear, those troublemakers again. Maybe they're just passing by." "Maybe," Thomas said softly, though he knew better. His intelligence suggested the Rising Tide was getting bolder, more aggressive. Something big was coming, and they were flexing their muscles in preparation. The rebels entered Murphy's with practiced intimidation, their leather jackets displaying their colors prominently. Marcus "Snake" Williams led the pack, his swagger carrying the casual arrogance of a man used to being feared. Behind him came his inner circle, Breaker Johnson, whose massive frame filled the doorway, and Ghost Peterson, whose eerily quiet demeanor masked a reputation for sudden violence. Thomas noticed the bulge under Snake's jacket, a new addition. The rebel leader hadn't carried openly before. Through decades of experience, he identified the weapon, a modified Glock, poorly concealed. The change concerned him. It indicated escalating aggression, preparation for something bigger. Several patrons quietly gathered their belongings and left, while others tried to make themselves invisible in their booths. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she continued wiping the same spot on the bar, her eyes carefully avoiding the newcomers. Well, Snake called out, his voice carrying across the now quieting tavern. "Looks like the local fossils are having themselves a little retirement party." Thomas continued sipping his whiskey, each movement unhurried but precise. He kept his head down, playing the role of a cautious elderly man that he'd perfected over decades, but his peripheral vision tracked every member of the gang. Breaker was moving between tables, casually knocking over drinks. Ghost had disappeared behind the pool table, taking up a position that covered the tavern's back exit. "Evening, gentlemen," Thomas called out pleasantly. "Looking for a quiet drink?" Snake's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing at the friendly tone. The gang leader stalked toward Thomas's position at the bar, his boots scuffing deliberately across the worn wooden floor. Thomas noted the leader's gait, favoring his left side slightly. Recent injury, probably within the last 24 hours. "Actually, old-timer," Snake sneered, reaching Thomas's spot at the bar. "We're looking for our cut. Tavern's in our territory. In case you hadn't heard, time for everyone to pay their respects." Margaret clutched her cleaning rag tighter. "This is outrageous. This tavern's been here for 60 years. "Margaret," Thomas interrupted gently, "why don't you go check on Mrs. Henderson's order? I'm sure she'd appreciate some fresh coffee." The elderly bartender hesitated, but something in Thomas's tone, a firmness beneath the suggestion, made her nod and move away. Snake watched her go with a smirk before turning back to Thomas. "Smart move getting the old lady clear," Snake said. "Wouldn't want her to see what happens to customers who don't understand how things work around here." Thomas maintained his friendly smile, but his eyes catalogued everything. The positions of all gang members, the number of civilians still in range, the potential improvised weapons within reach. "Things work just fine here," he said calmly. "Been working fine since before you were born." The fading light through Murphy's aged windows cast long shadows across Thomas Sullivan's features, softening the sharp edges that decades of service had carved into his face. At 97, he carried his years with a peculiar grace, his stooped shoulders and wrinkled hands concealing a lifetime of combat experience behind a facade of elderly fragility. To the regulars at Murphy's, he was just another fixture of Newport's waterfront district, as much a part of the scenery as the weathered fishing boats that bobbed in the harbor outside. Time had transformed him in ways that went beyond the physical. The once dark hair had long since turned white, his former military bearing masked by age's natural decline. What hadn't changed were his eyes, keen, alert, constantly assessing his surroundings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years behind enemy lines. 5 decades of playing the quiet widower hadn't dulled his training. Like many of Newport's older establishments, Murphy's Tavern held its own history. The dark wood paneling absorbed decades of stories. The brass rail of the bar, worn smooth by generations of sailors, fishermen, and locals. Thomas had chosen it carefully when he first returned from Europe, appreciating its multiple exits, clear sight lines, and the way sound carried across the room. Perfect for someone who needed to maintain awareness while appearing to enjoy a peaceful retirement. Margaret O'Brien had owned Murphy's for the past 30 years, inheriting it from her late husband Patrick. She'd watched Thomas Sullivan become part of the tavern's fabric, his daily routine as reliable as the tide. Every evening at precisely 7 p.m. he would arrive, order his Jameson, and settle into his corner spot at the bar. His quiet presence had a calming effect on the other regulars, though none of them could explain exactly why. "Your usual spot's always waiting for you, Tom," Margaret would say, and he'd respond with the same gentle smile, his Irish lilt softened by years in America. What she didn't know was that his chosen position offered perfect views of both entrances, the back hallway, and the street outside. Old habits, ingrained during years of covert operations in occupied France, didn't fade easily. The evening regulars each had their roles in this carefully maintained picture of small-town life. Harold Cooper, the retired high school history teacher, occupied his usual booth, grading papers and occasionally attempting to engage Thomas in discussions about the war. Thomas would deflect these conversations with practiced ease, maintaining his cover as someone who had served in a minor administrative role. If Cooper only knew about the operations Thomas had run with the French resistance, the Nazi supply lines disrupted, the intelligence networks established across occupied Europe. Sarah Chen, who ran the artisan bakery 2 doors down, always brought him fresh scones, claiming they were leftovers that would otherwise go to waste. Thomas accepted them with genuine gratitude, knowing her father had been among the Chinese-American soldiers who served with distinction in the European theater. The connection went unspoken, but the respect in her eyes told him she suspected there was more to his story than he let on. Through the tavern's front windows, Thomas could see Newport's changing face. The old fishing town had evolved, attracting wealthy summer residents and tourism, but its working-class heart still beat strongly along the waterfront. The rising tide rebels were a new symptom of this transformation, exploiting the tensions between old and new, using legitimate businesses as cover for more sinister operations. His secure phone buzzed again, another message from his long-maintained network: confirmed shipment, human cargo, port authorities compromised. Thomas deleted it while appearing to adjust his hearing aid, his thoughts turning to the intelligence he'd gathered over the past months. The rising tide wasn't just a gang of thugs. They were building something larger, more organized. Their increased presence in Newport wasn't random. They were preparing for something significant. Margaret approached with a fresh glass of Jameson, her movements carrying the weight of concern. "They're getting bolder, Tom," she said quietly, her eyes darting to where Snake Williams and his rebels continued their intimidation routine. Last week, they roughed up young Jimmy from the fish market, said he needed to pay for protection. His family's been selling fish here since before the war. Thomas nodded, letting his hand shake slightly as he reached for the glass. Times change. Margaret, not always for the better, but behind his careful facade of elderly resignation, his mind was processing the pattern of escalation. The rebels' tactics were evolving, becoming more sophisticated. Someone was directing them, teaching them how to establish systematic control over the waterfront. Through carefully concealed observation devices, disguised as hearing aids and reading glasses, Thomas monitored the rebels' movements. Their positioning wasn't random. They were establishing control points throughout the tavern, maintaining sightlines, controlling access to exits. These weren't the tactics of common thugs. This was military-style training being applied to civilian intimidation. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. Breaker Johnson had just knocked over another patron's drink, creating a distraction while Ghost Peterson moved to a new position near the back door. Their coordination was too precise for simple gang members. Thomas's decades of experience in covert operations recognized the signs. These men were being trained, professionalized. The question was, by whom? The tavern's atmosphere had shifted, tension rising as other patrons sensed the underlying menace. Thomas maintained his elderly demeanor, his hands appearing to tremble as he lifted his glass, but his mind was sharp, analyzing every detail. 5 decades of playing the quiet widower had taught him patience. Sometimes the best way to observe was to be overlooked, to let others mistake age for weakness, experience for frailty. Breaker Johnson reached across Thomas, deliberately knocking over his glass of Jameson. The amber liquid spread across the aged wood of the bar, dripping onto Thomas's worn cardigan. The rebel's massive frame loomed over him, a calculated attempt at intimidation that had probably worked countless times before. "Oops," Breaker sneered, his voice carrying artificial concern. "Guess your hands aren't as steady as they used to be, old-timer. Better be careful. Accidents happen all the time to folks who can't handle themselves." Thomas observed the spilled whiskey with what appeared to be elderly distress, his movements deliberately unsteady as he reached for a napkin. "No harm done," he said mildly, though his trained eye noted how Snake Williams had shifted position, moving to cut off the path to the front door. Happens to everyone now and then. "Everything all right here, Tom?" Margaret called from the other end of the bar, concern evident in her voice. She started to move toward them, but Thomas gave her a slight shake of his head. The movement was subtle, but it carried the authority of someone used to commanding in crisis situations. "Just a small spill, Margaret," he assured her, his Irish lilt carefully maintaining its usual gentle tone. "Nothing to worry about." But behind his calm exterior, Thomas's mind was processing multiple tactical scenarios. The rebels' positioning wasn't random. They were executing a practiced intimidation routine, one that suggested professional training. Snake Williams leaned against the bar, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. "You know, old man, there's been a lot of talk about you lately. Guy like you, living alone in that big house on Maple Street. Must have quite a nest egg stored away after all these years." Thomas noted the specific mention of his address. They'd been watching him, gathering intelligence. More evidence that the rising tide was evolving beyond a simple street gang. "Just a retired widower," he replied, letting his hands shake slightly as he dabbed at his wet cardigan, "living on Social Security like everyone else my age." "See, that's interesting," Snake continued, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Because our friends at the bank tell us different. Say you make some pretty regular withdrawals, pretty big ones too." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Kind of withdrawals that make people wonder what an old man needs that kind of cash for." Through his peripheral vision, Thomas tracked Ghost Peterson's movement toward the kitchen. The quiet rebel was positioning himself to control the tavern's back exit, using the same tactical approach Thomas had seen during operations in occupied France. These weren't random thugs. Someone had taught them military-style crowd control techniques. "Must be some mistake," Thomas mumbled, his voice carrying just the right note of elderly confusion. "I just get my monthly check, nothing more." But his mind was already connecting the pieces. The rising tide had access to bank information, suggesting connections to legitimate institutions. Their operation was more sophisticated than it appeared. Breaker moved closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Thomas. "Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Help you jog your memory about those withdrawals." His meaty hand reached for Thomas's shoulder, but before he could make contact, the tavern's door swung open. Chief Diana Martinez entered, her police uniform crisp despite the late hour. The rebels' posture changed instantly, their aggressive stance shifting to casual indifference. Thomas noted how quickly they adapted, another sign of professional training. "Evening, gentlemen," Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding respect. "Having a quiet drink?" Her hand rested casually on her utility belt, but Thomas recognized the ready stance of someone prepared for trouble. Snake Williams straightened, his demeanor switching to artificial politeness. "Just checking on our elderly friend here, Chief, making sure he gets home safe. A lot of dangerous people around these days." Martinez's eyes narrowed slightly. "How thoughtful of you, but I'm sure Mr. Sullivan can manage. He's been finding his way home from Murphy's longer than you've been alive." Thomas maintained his elderly facade, appearing grateful for the chief's intervention. "Thank you, Diana. Always nice to see our local law enforcement taking such good care of us seniors." His voice carried just the right amount of wavering gratitude, but his trained eye caught the subtle hand signals Snake was using to coordinate his men's positions. "Actually," Martinez said, "since you gentlemen are so concerned about community safety, maybe you'd like to discuss the recent increase in waterfront accidents. My office has been noticing some interesting patterns." The tension in the room shifted. Thomas observed how the rebels responded to pressure from authority, their movements, their reactions, all suggesting standardized training. Someone had taught them how to handle law enforcement encounters. "Just concerned citizens," Snake replied smoothly. "Can't blame us for wanting to look out for our community." but Thomas caught the quick glance between the rebel leader and Ghost Peterson, a coded communication that spoke of deeper coordination. Martinez took a step closer to Snake, her voice dropping. Funny thing about concerned citizens. They usually don't need to coordinate their community service with offshore bank accounts and late-night harbor deliveries. Thomas watched the subtle change in Snake's posture. A millisecond of surprise, quickly masked. The chief's comment had hit closer to home than the rebel leader expected. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Rising Tide's activities at the port, their access to banking information, their military-style training. It all pointed to something larger than simple gang operations. Just trying to make an honest living, Chief, Snake said, his casual tone not quite masking the underlying tension. Like everyone else in Newport, he gestured to his men, and they began moving toward the door, their withdrawal as coordinated as their entrance had been. Chief Martinez watched the rebels depart, her experienced eye noting their coordinated movement. Once their motorcycles had faded into the distance, she turned to Thomas, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "You all right, Mr. Sullivan? They weren't giving you too much trouble?" Thomas maintained his elderly persona, hands still appearing to shake as he dabbed at his whiskey-stained cardigan. "Nothing I can't handle, dear. At my age, you learn to take things in stride." Through his peripheral vision, he noticed Margaret approaching with a fresh glass of Jameson, her movements carrying both concern and relief. "On the house, Tom," Margaret said, setting down the drink. "Least I can do after all that unpleasantness." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "They were asking about you earlier this week, too. Wanting to know your schedule, your habits." Chief Martinez's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her utility belt. "Is that so? When exactly was this, Mrs. O'Brien?" As Margaret described the rebels' previous visits, Thomas's mind processed the implications. They weren't just gathering intelligence on him, they were establishing a pattern, building towards something specific. His secure phone vibrated again. "Confirmation, 3 cargo containers, North Dock, midnight. Human signatures detected." "I should probably head home," Thomas announced, carefully rising from his bar stool with the deliberate slowness of age. "Getting late for these old bones." His movements appeared uncertain, but each step was precisely calculated to maintain his cover while allowing him to observe the tavern's other patrons. "I'll walk you out, Mr. Sullivan," Martinez offered, her tone casual but her eyes alert. As they stepped into the cool evening air, she lowered her voice. "You know, for someone who claims to have spent the war pushing papers in London, you handle pressure remarkably well." Thomas allowed a slight smile to crease his weathered features. "At my age, dear, very little seems worth getting excited about." But he noted how she positioned herself, maintaining clear sightlines while appearing to simply assist an elderly man. She'd been trained well. "Interesting thing about the Rising Tide," Martinez continued as they walked. 6 months ago, they were just another motorcycle gang. Now they're running sophisticated operations, using military-style tactics, accessing secured financial information. Makes a person wonder who's really behind their sudden evolution. They reached Thomas's car, a well-maintained but outdated Volvo that perfectly matched his careful cover. "The world's changing, Chief Martinez, not always for the better." He fumbled slightly with his keys, playing to his role, while his trained senses monitored their surroundings. 2 unmarked vehicles had passed by twice. Surveillance teams, probably the rebels, but their technique suggested professional training. "You know," Martinez said, helping him with the car door, "I did some research on the Special Operations Executive. Fascinating organization, particularly their operations in occupied France. Trained operatives to blend in, maintain deep cover, coordinate resistance activities. Some of those operatives stayed in their roles for years after the war, keeping watch for new threats. Thomas settled into the driver's seat with careful movements. "History's full of interesting stories, Chief, but at my age, most of them start to blur together." Yet he recognized the message beneath her words. She knew, or at least suspected, more than she let on. "Just be careful, Mr. Sullivan," she said, closing his car door. "Newport may not be occupied, France, but some wars don't end with treaties and parades." As Thomas drove home, his elderly paced driving masking his tactical awareness, he processed the evening's events. The rising tide's activities, Chief Martinez's subtle message, the intelligence about human cargo at the docks, pieces of a larger pattern were emerging. In his rearview mirror, he noted a motorcycle following at a discreet distance. Ghost Peterson, the rebel scout, maintaining surveillance but trying too hard to appear casual. Another sign of incomplete training. Someone was teaching them advanced tactics, but they hadn't yet mastered the subtleties. Thomas's modest two-story Victorian came into view, its weathered elegance perfectly matching his cover as a retired widower. The porch lights were on. He never left them on. A signal from his network, warning of activity in his absence. Through decades-old habits, he continued past his house, appearing to be an elderly man momentarily confused about his location. His secure phone vibrated again. "Team in position. Confirmation required." Thomas took a careful turn around the block, noting two more motorcycles poorly concealed in side streets. The rebels were establishing a perimeter around his house, but their positioning suggested they'd been trained for urban combat, not covert surveillance. As he finally pulled into his driveway, Thomas appeared to be nothing more than an elderly man returning from his evening routine at the local tavern. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he collected his keys and newspaper from the passenger seat. But behind the facade of age and infirmity, his mind was processing multiple scenarios, evaluating threats, preparing responses. The porch creaked beneath his feet as he approached his front door, the same creak that had warned him of countless late-night visitors during his active service years. Tonight, it carried its own message. Someone had recently crossed it, their weight slightly shifting the aged boards in a pattern his experienced senses recognized. Thomas entered his house with the careful movements of age, making a show of struggling slightly with his keys. His trained eye immediately caught the subtle signs of intrusion. A picture frame shifted 2 millimeters, the hall runner's edge slightly disturbed, the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne. They'd searched his house while he was at Murphy's, but their technique had been professional, meant to be undetectable to ordinary observation. Through the front window, he noted Ghost Peterson's motorcycle passing by again, maintaining their surveillance pattern. In the kitchen, Thomas began his nightly routine, appearing to any observer as nothing more than an elderly man preparing his evening tea. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, his mind processed the implications of the rebels' increased interest. His secure phone buzzed again, this time with more detailed intelligence. 3 cargo containers confirmed, human signatures match pattern, trafficking operation. Port Authority Supervisor James Chen compromised, payment traced to offshore. Accounts linked to rising tide shell companies. The pieces were falling into place. The rebels' sudden sophistication, their access to financial systems, their military-style training, it all pointed to something larger than a simple gang operation. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were being transformed into something more dangerous. As he waited for his tea to steep, Thomas activated his hidden security system, disguised as an outdated home alarm panel. Multiple screens lit up in his basement command center, showing feeds from carefully concealed cameras throughout Newport's waterfront district. The Rising Tides compound near the old fishing warehouses was alive with activity, vehicles coming and going with military precision. Movement at North Dock, his system reported. Multiple vehicles, professional security teams, pattern matches previous trafficking operations in Boston and Providence. Through his surveillance network, Thomas observed teams of men unloading equipment from unmarked vans, not the rebels' usual gear, but sophisticated security systems and communications equipment. Their movements showed clear military training, their coordination suggesting recent combat experience. The rising tide was being professionally equipped and trained, but the question was, by whom? His landline rang, the old-fashioned telephone he maintained as part of his cover. "Mr. Sullivan?" Margaret O'Brien's voice carried barely controlled concern. "Sorry to call so late, but there's something you should know. After you left, some men in suits came to the tavern. They were asking questions about you, showing badges that looked federal." Thomas let his voice carry elderly confusion. "Federal agents? Must be some mistake, Margaret. I'm just a retired widower." "That's just it, Tom. They weren't just asking about now. They were asking about your time in Europe during the war, specific questions about London and France. And they knew things, details about the tavern's history that even I didn't know." Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas noticed two unmarked sedans parked at different points near his house, their occupants maintaining professional surveillance positions. Not the rebels this time. These were trained operators, their techniques suggesting government or private security background. "Try not to worry, Margaret," he assured her, while his mind processed this new development. "Probably just some routine. Or check about old pension records." But he recognized the pattern. Someone was digging into his past, looking beyond his carefully maintained cover story. After ending the call, Thomas activated his secure communications system, hidden behind a panel of vintage war photos. "Control, we have additional players in the field. Professional teams, likely federal or private contractors. They're asking questions about SOE operations." The response came quickly. "Confirmed. Similar inquiries detected in London and Paris. Someone's connecting the old networks to current trafficking patterns." Thomas moved to his study, maintaining his elderly pace, while his trained senses remained alert for any surveillance. The room appeared to be nothing more than an old man's sanctuary, filled with books and mementos from a long life. But behind the facade of retirement, it contained sophisticated monitoring equipment disguised as outdated electronics. New data scrolled across his hidden screens: financial transactions, shipping manifests, surveillance photos. The rising tides. Operation was larger than even he had suspected. They weren't just trafficking humans through Newport. They were establishing a sophisticated network, using techniques that seemed eerily familiar. "Cross-reference current trafficking patterns with SOE resistance routes," he instructed his system. The results were revealing. The rising tides operation was following almost exactly the same paths that the French resistance had used to evacuate Allied airmen during the war. Someone with intimate knowledge of those old networks was helping them establish their modern-day slavery pipeline. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Chief Martinez. "Federal task force arriving. Tomorrow, official story, organized crime investigation. Real focus, connection between current trafficking and historical evacuation routes. They know about the old networks, Tom." Thomas studied the vintage map of France hanging on his wall, his mind overlaying the old escape routes with the rising tides' current trafficking patterns. Someone was using his old playbook against him, corrupting the carefully crafted resistance networks into channels for human trafficking. The question wasn't just who, it was why they'd chosen Newport, why now, and why they seemed so interested in one elderly veteran who supposedly had spent the war behind a desk in London. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas watched more unmarked vehicles arrive at the waterfront. The rising tides operation was accelerating, but so was the attention it was attracting. Federal agents, private security teams, and professionally trained rebels, all converging on Newport, all somehow connected to events that had happened over 7 decades ago in occupied France. Thomas settled into his command center, the basement's old leather chair creaking softly as he activated his most sophisticated surveillance systems. The vintage radio equipment that lined the walls, a carefully curated collection that any visitor would dismiss as an old man's hobby, sprang to life with encrypted communications. Through decades of patient preparation, he had woven an invisible web of observation posts throughout Newport's waterfront district. The first signal came from a concealed camera near the North Dock. Multiple vehicles approaching from the southwest, professional security detail, advanced counter-surveillance techniques. The Rising Tide's operation was moving into its active phase, but their movements suggested more than just gang activity. These were coordinated military-style maneuvers. His secure phone vibrated with an update from Chief Martinez. Federal team arriving early. 3 unmarked vehicles just passed the state line. They're not waiting for tomorrow. Thomas's weathered fingers moved across his keyboard, accessing traffic camera feeds that showed the approaching federal convoy. Their driving pattern confirmed. Martinez's warning, this wasn't a standard task force, but something more specialized. Through his surveillance network, Thomas observed a disturbing pattern emerging at the docks. The Rising Tide rebels had established a sophisticated perimeter, their positions mirroring classic resistance techniques he'd helped develop during the war. Ghost Peterson's team was running counter-surveillance sweeps with professional efficiency, while Breaker Johnson's group maintained strategic control points around the cargo area. Target vehicle approaching North Gate, his system reported. Matching pattern from Boston operation. Thomas switched feeds to observe a nondescript delivery van passing through the rebels' security cordon. The driver's movements, the way the vehicle maintained precise distances from its escorts, everything screamed professional training. A new message flashed across his screen, this one from his old network in London. Confirmed, Operation Paperclip. Files accessed last week. Someone's looking into post-war relocations. Thomas's jaw tightened. Those files contained details about how the SOE had helped resettle resistance fighters after the war, establishing new identities and safe routes that spanned continents. Someone was using that classified information to rebuild those routes for darker purposes. His landline rang again, the special one hidden behind his bookshelf, a number known to only a handful of people still alive. They're moving faster than we anticipated, the voice said without preamble. Thomas recognized it immediately. Marie Dubois, 93, former French resistance fighter and one of his most trusted operatives. Our friends in Paris report similar patterns. They're not just using our old routes, Thomas. They're using our old protocols, our recognition signals. How many of the original network are still active? Thomas asked, his Irish lilt dropping. Away as he slipped back into operational mode. Besides you and me, maybe 3, Pierre in Brussels, Anatoly in Prague, and possibly Christina in Stockholm. But Thomas... Marie paused, her voice carrying decades of shared experience. The files they accessed, they didn't just contain routes. They had our contingency plans, our emergency protocols. Thomas watched through his feeds as more vehicles arrived at the dock. The Rising Tide's security pattern was expanding, establishing layers of defense that eerily mirrored how the resistance had protected critical safe houses. They're not just copying our old playbook, he said slowly. They're anticipating our responses. Exactly, Marie confirmed. Someone who knew us, knew how we think, is behind this. Someone who... The line suddenly crackled with interference. Through his monitors, Thomas noticed coordinated electronic jamming sweeping across the waterfront district. The Rising Tide had just activated military-grade communications equipment. His secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from Martinez. Multiple teams converging on your location. Not just feds, private contractors, heavy equipment. They know, Thomas. They know about the basement, Thomas's decades of training kicked in as he initiated emergency protocols. His fingers flew across the keyboard, activating systems that had lain dormant for years. Throughout his house, concealed panels slid open, revealing cached weapons and equipment that no one would expect to find in an elderly widower's home. Through his cameras, he watched 3 separate teams approaching his house. The first, obviously federal agents, moved with professional precision but clear protocols. The second team wore rising tide colors but moved with military discipline. The third group concerned him most: private contractors, their movements suggesting extensive black ops training. "Marie," he said into the secure line, "implement Protocol 7, like we discussed." He could almost see his old friend's grim smile as she acknowledged the code they'd established decades ago. Within minutes, secure databases across Europe would begin releasing carefully selected intelligence about the Rising Tides operation and about the forces really behind their sudden transformation. His surveillance feeds showed Ghost Peterson's team setting up sniper positions with professional efficiency. They were good, but their training wasn't complete. They'd missed 2 of his concealed observation posts, giving him crucial visibility of their deployment pattern. More importantly, they'd missed the old tunnel entrance, a relic from Newport's rum-running days that he'd carefully maintained over the decades. Chief Martinez's unmarked car appeared at the end of his street, her driving pattern signaling that she was alone and uncompromised. Through his cameras, Thomas watched her expertly note and evaluate the multiple teams converging on his position. She understood the situation, not just the immediate tactical scenario, but the deeper implications of what was unfolding. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile as he initiated his final preparations. Age had slowed his body, but 7 decades of experience had sharpened his mind. Someone was using his old methods against him, believing they could outmaneuver the elderly. Veteran they dismissed as a harmless relic, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that his age made him vulnerable, forgetting that survival in his profession required constant adaptation. As multiple teams closed in on his position, Thomas Sullivan, former SOE operative and veteran of countless covert operations, prepared to demonstrate why underestimating one's opponents was always a fatal error. The night was about to become very interesting indeed. Thomas activated his house's defensive systems with practiced efficiency, each movement deliberate despite his advanced age. Emergency lights bathed his command center in a soft red glow as he watched the approaching teams through his surveillance network. The Rising Tide rebels had established a perimeter around his block, their positioning suggesting they'd been trained in urban containment operations. The federal agents were maintaining a wider cordon, while the private contractors moved with the confident precision of experienced wetwork teams. "Target is secure in basement level," one of the contractors reported through a channel Thomas had already compromised. "Thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures from electronic equipment. Subject appears to be alone." Their professionalism was evident in their communication discipline, but they hadn't counted on facing someone who had helped write their tactical playbook. His secure phone vibrated with an update from Marie. Protocol 7 initiated. Files releasing to selected outlets in 30 minutes. Our friends in London and Paris are standing by. Thomas allowed himself a tight smile. After decades of preparation, their contingency plans were finally being activated. Through his feeds, he watched Chief Martinez carefully position her vehicle to block the intersection, appearing to be setting up a routine traffic control point, while actually disrupting the contractor's planned containment pattern. Her understanding of tactical operations suggested her background was more specialized than her current position implied. "All teams, prepare for breach," the contractor leader ordered. "Primary target is the basement command center. Secondary objective is the subject himself. Command wants him alive for questioning." Their approach was textbook perfect, exactly as he had helped design it for post-war intelligence operations, which made their vulnerabilities predictable. Thomas's gnarled fingers moved across his keyboard with surprising dexterity, activating systems that had been carefully maintained and updated over decades. Throughout his property, concealed sensors tracked the movement of every approaching operative. The Rising Tide rebels had established sniper positions that were professional but incomplete. They'd missed the angles he'd specifically designed. Into his home's architecture, Ghost team in position, Peterson reported through their encrypted channel. No movement visible through primary windows. The rebel's voice carried the confidence of recent training, but Thomas noted the subtle signs of inexperience in their deployment pattern. They were good, but their training wasn't complete. His landline rang, the special one, and he answered without taking his eyes off the monitors. "They've accessed the paperclip archives," Marie informed him, her voice tight with urgency. "Not just the transportation routes, but the personnel files. They know about Operation Watchmaker." Thomas's jaw clenched. Operation Watchmaker had been their most closely guarded secret, a post-war initiative to maintain a network of sleeping agents throughout Europe and America. Most had been resistance fighters, given new identities and positioned in strategic locations, ready to reactivate if the Cold War turned hot. "How deep did they get?" "Deep enough to know about Newport," Marie replied. "About why you really chose this location." Through his cameras, Thomas watched the federal agents adjust their positions, their movements suggesting they'd just received new intelligence. "They know about the tunnel system, Thomas. The old tunnel network had been built during Prohibition, connecting key points along Newport's waterfront. After the war, Thomas and his team had carefully mapped and maintained these passages, integrating them into their contingency plans. Now, decades later, those same tunnels were being used to transport human cargo. His surveillance system flagged new movement at the North Dock. The Rising Tide's operation was accelerating, multiple vehicles arriving, their pattern matching previous trafficking operations. But something was different this time. Their deployment suggested they were expecting interference, preparing for a confrontation. "Marie," Thomas said quietly, "implement the second phase of Protocol 7. It's time to wake the old network." He heard her sharp intake of breath, understanding the implications. Across Europe and America, carefully placed agents, now in their 80s and 90s, would receive predetermined signals, activating responses planned decades ago. Through his feeds, he watched the contractors begin their final approach. Their thermal imaging would show them his heat signature in the basement, exactly where they expected him to be. What they couldn't know was that his command center had been designed with this scenario in mind, incorporating lessons learned from resistance operations in occupied France. His secure phone vibrated with a message from Martinez. "Federal team has new orders. They're looking for something specific in your files, something about Operation Watchmaker." Thomas nodded grimly. The pieces were falling into place. Someone wasn't just using their old routes for trafficking, they were systematically accessing and exploiting the entire post-war intelligence network. A subtle vibration ran through his house as the contractors breached his perimeter. Their approach was silent, professional, but Thomas's decades-old sensors tracked every movement. He watched Ghost Peterson's team adjust their positions, unconsciously responding to tactical protocols he had helped establish long ago. "All teams cleared for full breach," the contractor leader ordered. "Be advised, subject is considered high value despite age. Extensive intelligence background suspected." Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. They had good intel, but they didn't understand what they were really dealing with. His cameras showed Martinez slowly working her way closer to his position, her movements disguised as routine police activity. She understood what was about to happen. Not just the immediate tactical situation, but the larger implications of what was being uncovered. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades of preparation settling around him like a familiar coat. Someone had spent years unraveling their old networks, turning paths of resistance into corridors of exploitation. Tonight, they would learn why the original architects of those networks had been chosen for their roles. His fingers moved across his keyboard one final time, initiating sequences that would coordinate responses across multiple continents. In safe houses and quiet retirements, aging agents would receive signals they had hoped never to see. The old network was awakening, responding to protocols established when the world was last torn apart by war. "They're starting their breach," Marie reported tensely. "Are you ready?" Thomas watched the multiple teams converge on his position, their movements precise but predictable. Age had slowed his body, but experience had taught him patience. Sometimes victory didn't require speed or strength. Sometimes it just required understanding how your opponents think. "I'm ready," he replied quietly. "Let's show them why some secrets were meant to stay buried." The first breach came exactly where Thomas expected. The cellar door on the east side, chosen for its apparent vulnerability. Through his monitors, he watched the contractor team move with practiced precision, their thermal imaging equipment revealing what they thought was his position in the basement. Behind them, Ghost Peterson's rebels maintained their containment pattern, while the federal agents held their wider perimeter. "Target location confirmed," the contractor leader whispered into his encrypted channel, "moving to secure package." Their professionalism was evident in every movement, but they were following protocols Thomas had helped write decades ago. Which meant he knew exactly what they would do next. His secure phone vibrated with an update from Marie. "London archives accessed. They're looking for specific documents about Operation Watchmaker's Newport hub." Thomas nodded grimly. Someone wasn't just investigating old SOE operations. They were systematically mapping the entire post-war intelligence network. Through his surveillance feeds, he watched Chief Martinez coordinate with the federal team, her movements suggesting she was sharing crucial intelligence about the property's layout. But Thomas noted how she carefully omitted certain details, understanding that some secrets needed to remain hidden. "Breach team in position," the contractors reported. "No movement from target." Their thermal imaging showed exactly what Thomas wanted them to see: a heat signature in his command center, surrounded by active electronic equipment. What they couldn't know was that his decades of experience had taught him how to manipulate such technology. His fingers moved across his keyboard, initiating sequences that would coordinate responses across his carefully prepared defenses. Throughout the house, hidden systems activated, each designed to counter specific tactical approaches. The Rising Tide rebels had established what they thought were optimal firing positions, but Thomas had designed his home's architecture around much older principles of defense. "Multiple teams converging on basement access points," his system reported. Thomas watched through his feeds as the contractors split into 3 groups, following standard breach protocols. Their movement patterns were textbook perfect, exactly as he would have trained them, which made their reactions predictable. The first team breached the cellar door with professional efficiency, their entry covered by Ghost Peterson's sniper team. They moved through the initial chamber with practiced coordination, their thermal imaging guiding them toward what appeared to be Thomas's heat signature. Behind them, federal agents adjusted their positions, responding to new intelligence about the tunnel network beneath Newport. "Command, we have movement in the target area," the lead contractor reported. "Heat signature is consistent with subject's profile." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Decades of running resistance operations had taught him the value of letting opponents see exactly what they expected to find. His landline rang, the secure one, and Marie's voice carried urgent news. They've accessed the final layer of paperclip files. Thomas, they know about the contingency vaults. His jaw tightened. The vaults had been established after the war, containing evidence of wartime collaboration that could destroy powerful families even decades later. Through his cameras, Thomas observed new movement at the North Dock. The rising tide's trafficking operation was accelerating, but their pattern had changed. They weren't just moving cargo, they were preparing for a major confrontation. Someone had warned them that tonight was different. All teams be advised, the contractor leader ordered. Secondary objective confirmed. Target's files contain priority intelligence about Operation Watchmaker. Thomas watched them adjust their approach, their movements revealing their true mission. They weren't just here for him. They wanted the documented proof of who had really helped rebuild Europe after the war. His surveillance system highlighted Martinez's careful movement toward the house's rear entrance. She understood the bigger picture, how the rising tide's trafficking operation connected to decades-old intelligence networks. Her positioning suggested she was preparing to intervene at a crucial moment. Marie, Thomas said quietly into his secure line, implement Protocol 7's final phase. He heard her sharp intake of breath, knowing what this meant. Across Europe and America, aging agents would receive signals that would activate their last, most crucial assignments, exposing the corruption of their old networks. The contractor team reached his command center's outer door, their thermal imaging showing them exactly what they expected to see. Thomas watched through his feeds as they prepared for their final breach, their movements practiced and precise. What they couldn't know was that his decades of experience had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Target area secured, the team leader reported. Moving to extract package. Thomas's fingers moved across his keyboard one last time, initiating sequences that would coordinate responses across multiple continents. In quiet retirements and peaceful homes, elderly agents would receive coded messages they had hoped never to see. His cameras showed Ghost Peterson's team adjusting their positions, unconsciously responding to tactical protocols established decades ago. The federal agents were receiving new intelligence, their deployment suggesting they now understood the true scope of what they had uncovered. Through his monitors, Thomas watched the multiple teams converge on his position, their movements revealing their training and their limitations. Age had taught him patience, and experience had shown him that victory often came not from confrontation, but from understanding how your opponents think. They're starting their final approach, Marie reported tensely. The files are ready to release on your signal. Thomas nodded, watching the contractors prepare their breach charges. 7 decades of preparation had led to this moment when the carefully maintained balance between past and present would finally shift. Remember, he said quietly, sometimes the best defense is letting your opponents think they've won. With that, Thomas Sullivan, veteran of countless covert operations, prepared to demonstrate why some secrets were best left undisturbed and why underestimating an old operative was always a fatal mistake. The breach charges detonated with precisely calculated force, designed to minimize structural damage while maximizing tactical advantage. Through his surveillance network, Thomas watched the contractor team surge through the smoke, their movements exhibiting the kind of precision that only came from extensive Black Ops training. "Command! Breaching final door," the team leader reported. "Heat signature still stable." Their thermal imaging showed them what appeared to be an elderly man surrounded by electronic equipment, exactly where their intelligence suggested he would be. It was a perfect tactical approach to a target that didn't exist. His secure phone vibrated with an urgent message from Marie. "Files releasing in 3 minutes. London and Paris networks are reporting unusual activity. Someone's trying To access the old emergency protocols. Thomas nodded grimly. Their opponents weren't just after him. They were attempting to seize control of the entire post-war intelligence infrastructure. Through his feeds, he watched Chief Martinez coordinate with specific members of the federal team, her movements suggesting she was implementing a carefully planned counter-operation. The rising tide rebels maintained their containment positions, but Thomas noticed subtle changes in their deployment. Someone was giving them updated intelligence. "Target area secured," the contractor team announced as they breached his command center. But something's wrong. Their thermal imaging showed them an empty room. The heat signature they'd been tracking revealed as nothing more than a carefully calibrated decoy. "Command, target is not in the basement. Repeat, we do not have the package." Thomas allowed himself a tight smile as he watched from his real command center, hidden within Newport's old tunnel network. Decades of experience had taught him the value of letting opponents think they understood your capabilities. The contractors had breached exactly the facility he had wanted them to find. "All teams, be advised," the contractor leader ordered, his voice tense with sudden uncertainty. "Target location unknown. Initiate secondary search protocols." But Thomas had already anticipated their response patterns, having helped design the very protocols they were following. His surveillance system highlighted new movement at the North Dock. The Rising Tide's trafficking operation was shifting into its next phase, but their deployment suggested internal confusion. Someone in their command structure had just realized that their carefully planned operation was compromised. "Thomas," Marie's voice came through his secure line, "the files are releasing now. First responses coming in from London. Multiple high-level alerts at MI6 and Interpol. Across Europe and America, carefully selected intelligence about the corruption of post-war evacuation routes was beginning to emerge." Through his monitors, Thomas watched the contractors split into search teams, their movements revealing their growing frustration. They had expected to find an elderly veteran, perhaps with some old files and outdated equipment. Instead, they had discovered that their target had anticipated and countered their every move. "Command, we're finding evidence of extensive surveillance throughout the property," one team reported. "This isn't just some retired operative's hobby setup. This is professional-grade monitoring equipment, recently updated." Their tone carried dawning realization about the true nature of their target. The federal agents were receiving new orders, their deployment pattern shifting as fresh intelligence arrived from Washington. Thomas watched through his feeds as they began to move away from the house, their attention turning toward the North Dock. Someone in their command structure had finally connected the dots between his surveillance operation and the Rising Tide's trafficking activities. "Ghost team, maintain position," Peterson ordered his rebels, but Thomas noted the uncertainty in his voice. Their professional training was starting to crack as they realized they were facing something beyond their experience. These weren't the actions of a retired veteran. This was an active operation run by someone who had never stopped watching. His secure phone vibrated with an update from Chief Martinez. "Federal task force receiving new jurisdiction orders. They're shifting. Focus to the dock operation." "Thomas, they know about the connection to Operation Watchmaker." He nodded grimly. The carefully maintained balance between past and present was finally shifting. Through his surveillance network, Thomas observed multiple teams adjusting their positions, responding to the changing tactical situation. The contractors were expanding their search pattern, but their movements revealed their confusion. They had breached his decoy facility with perfect precision, only to find themselves caught in a web of counter-surveillance decades in the making. "Marie," Thomas said quietly into his secure line, "initiate the final sequence. It's time to show them why some networks were meant to stay hidden." He heard her quick acknowledgement, knowing that across Europe, aging agents were receiving their last, most crucial signals. His cameras showed the rising tides operation at the North Dock beginning to unravel. Their professional facade was cracking as their trained teams realized they were being outmaneuvered by an opponent they couldn't see. Ghost Peterson's snipers maintained their positions, but their disciplined coordination was failing. All teams, priority shift, the contractor leader ordered, his voice tight with controlled frustration. Target is utilizing underground infrastructure. Repeat, subject has access to tunnel network. But Thomas had already anticipated this realization, having spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Through his monitors, he watched Chief Martinez begin her own operation, coordinating with specific federal agents while appearing to maintain her role as local law enforcement. She understood the delicate balance required, how to expose the trafficking operation without revealing the full scope of the intelligence network behind it. Files fully released, Marie reported. First media inquiries coming in. London and Paris networks report multiple high-level resignations already. Thomas nodded, watching the carefully orchestrated exposure begin to take effect. Sometimes, victory came not from direct confrontation, but from knowing which secrets to reveal and which to preserve. His surveillance feeds showed the multiple teams beginning to realize the true nature of their situation. They had come expecting to find an elderly veteran with outdated equipment and a few old files. Instead, they had walked into an operation run by someone who had spent 7 decades preparing for this exact scenario. "They're starting to understand," Marie said quietly. "But Thomas, there's more coming. Our friends in Brussels report unusual movement patterns. Someone's activating the old emergency protocols." Through his cameras, Thomas watched new vehicles approaching the Newport waterfront, unmarked sedans carrying teams with very specific training. The night was far from over, and Thomas Sullivan, veteran of countless covert operations, prepared to demonstrate why some networks had survived for 7 decades without detection. Age had slowed his body, but experience had taught him that true victory often came from patience, preparation, and the careful manipulation of what others thought they knew. Thomas watched through his surveillance network as the situation at the North Dock erupted into barely controlled chaos. The rising tides trafficking operation was collapsing as federal agents moved in, their coordinated response suggesting they'd received detailed intelligence about the cargo container's contents. Ghost Peterson's team maintained their positions, but their professional veneer was cracking under pressure. Multiple teams converging on primary targets, his system reported. Through carefully positioned cameras, Thomas observed Chief Martinez coordinating with specific federal agents, their movements indicating they understood the true nature of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about human trafficking anymore. This was about exposing a decades-old network that had been corrupted from within. His secure phone vibrated with an urgent update from Marie. "Brussels network compromised. Someone's accessing the emergency protocols we established in 48. Thomas, they're trying to activate Collection Point 7. His jaw tightened. Collection Point 7 had been their primary evacuation hub during the war, a complex network of safe houses and transit, routes that spanned 3 countries. "Command, subject surveillance network is still active," the contractor leader reported, frustration evident in his voice. "He's monitoring everything. Repeat, all operations are compromised." Through his feeds, Thomas watched them attempt to counter his systems, but they were fighting against decades of careful preparation and adaptation. New vehicles were arriving at the waterfront, unmarked sedans carrying teams with very specific training. Thomas recognized their deployment pattern. These were members of the old network, but not ones he and Marie had activated. Someone else was calling in assets that had been dormant since the war. "Thomas," Martinez's voice came through his secure line. Federal team just received new orders directly from Washington. They're talking about Operation Paperclip, about how the evacuation routes were compromised after the war. How deep does this go? He could hear the tension in her voice. She was starting to understand the true scope of what they'd uncovered. Through his monitors, Thomas observed the rising tide rebels beginning to fragment. Their professional training was falling apart as they realized they were caught between multiple opposing forces. Ghost Peterson's snipers maintained their positions, but their coordinated movements had devolved into individual survival responses. "Marie," Thomas said quietly, "implement contingency 9. He heard her sharp intake of breath, understanding the implications. Contingency 9 had been their absolute last resort. The complete exposure of how certain powerful families had used the post-war chaos to establish criminal enterprises using resistance networks. His surveillance system highlighted new movement patterns at the dock. The federal agents were securing the cargo containers, but Thomas noticed how certain teams were being redirected away from specific areas. Someone in their command structure was still trying to maintain control of the old network's infrastructure. "All teams priority shift," the contractor leader ordered. "Target is actively monitoring and countering our operations. Fall back to secondary positions." But Thomas had already anticipated their response, having helped establish the very protocols they were following. Their tactical retreat was leading them exactly where he wanted them. The secure phone vibrated again, this time with a message he had hoped never to see. "Thomas," Marie's voice was tight with urgency, "they're accessing the Stockholm files. Christina's network is being compromised. They're going to expose everything, including the names of agents we relocated after the war." Through his feeds, Thomas watched the multiple teams adjusting their positions, responding to rapidly changing intelligence. The contractors were attempting to regain tactical control, but their movements revealed their growing uncertainty. They had come prepared to handle a retired operative, not a fully active intelligence network. "Ghost team, maintain containment," Peterson ordered his rebels, but their disciplined facade was crumbling. These weren't just gang members anymore. They were trained operatives who suddenly realized they were pawns in a much larger game. Their professional positioning was becoming increasingly erratic. His cameras showed Chief Martinez implementing her own carefully planned operation, coordinating with specific federal agents while appearing to maintain normal law enforcement protocols. She understood the delicate balance required. How to expose the trafficking operation without revealing the full extent of the intelligence network behind it. "Files from Contingency 9 releasing now," Marie reported. "First responses coming in from major media outlets. Thomas, it's working. The old families are starting to panic." Across Europe and America, carefully selected intelligence was beginning to expose how post-war evacuation routes had been corrupted into criminal enterprises. Through his surveillance network, Thomas observed new vehicles approaching his position, these ones moving with the distinctive pattern of high-level government security teams. Someone in Washington had finally connected all the dots and understood exactly what was being unveiled. In Newport, "Command, we have multiple breach points compromised," the contractor leader reported, his voice tight with professional frustration. "Subjects' countermeasures are exceeding anticipated capabilities. Request immediate extraction protocol." Their tactical retreat was becoming less organized as they realized the true nature of their target. The night was reaching its crucial phase, and Thomas Sullivan, veteran of countless covert operations, prepared to demonstrate why some secrets had remained hidden for 7 decades. Age had given him patience, and experience had taught him that true victory often came not from direct confrontation, but from understanding exactly when and how to reveal the truth. His monitors showed the vinyl pieces falling into place as multiple teams converged on the waterfront. The carefully maintained balance between past and present was about to shift irrevocably, and Thomas prepared to ensure that this time the right secrets would be exposed while the most crucial networks remained protected. Through his cameras, he watched as decades of careful preparation culminated in this single night. Sometimes, he reflected, the most effective operation was the one where your opponents never fully understood what they had stumbled into until it was too late to stop the inevitable cascade of revelations. Thomas Sullivan emerged from the hidden tunnel entrance near Murphy's Tavern, his movements deliberate but purposeful despite his age. Through his surveillance feeds, he watched the chaos unfolding across Newport's waterfront as multiple operations collided. The rising tide's trafficking network was exposed, federal agents were securing evidence, and long-buried secrets were finally coming to light. Targets spotted, the contractor team reported, but their usual precision was gone. Subject is, he's at Murphy's Tavern. The confusion in their voice was evident. They had spent hours searching his house, only to find their elderly target calmly walking into the local bar. Through his earpiece, Marie's voice carried a note of satisfaction. The last files are released. London, Paris, Brussels, they're all responding. The old families can't contain it anymore. Decades of carefully preserved evidence was now public, exposing how post-war evacuation routes had been corrupted into criminal enterprises. Chief, Martinez's car pulled up outside Murphy's, her arrival timed perfectly. "It's done, Thomas," she said as she entered the tavern. "Federal team has secured the containers, 27 people rescued. The Rising Tides operation is finished." Her voice carried professional satisfaction mixed with deeper understanding of what had really been accomplished. Margaret O'Brien stood behind the bar, her keen eyes taking in the scene as Thomas settled into his usual spot. She poured his customary Jameson without being asked, understanding that some routines remained important even on extraordinary nights. "You're late tonight, Tom," she commented, her tone suggesting she knew more than she let on. After all, Murphy's Tavern had been a key location in Newport's underground network since long before Thomas had made it his regular spot. Through his surveillance feeds, Thomas watched Ghost Peterson's team finally break formation, their professional training crumbling as they realized the full scope of what they'd been involved in. The federal agents were securing the dock area, but specific teams, ones Thomas and Marie had quietly contacted, were ensuring that certain old networks remained protected. "Command, target is—" The contractor leader hesitated, frustration evident in his voice. "Target is having a drink at Murphy's Tavern, awaiting instructions." Their tactical uncertainty was clear. All their training hadn't prepared them for an elderly operative who had spent decades preparing for this exact scenario. Thomas sipped his whiskey, its familiar warmth a contrast to the cold precision of the operation he'd just orchestrated. Through his earpiece, Marie updated him on the cascading effects of their revelations. Stockholm network secure. Christina sent word. They're falling back to the old protocols. The right secrets are safe, Thomas. The ones that needed to be exposed are out. Chief Martinez sat beside him, maintaining the appearance of a local police chief checking on an elderly resident. "Washington's scrambling," she said quietly. "The files you released, they're already talking about congressional investigations. The Rising Tide was just the surface, what they were really using those old routes for." She shook her head, understanding the magnitude of what had been uncovered. Through his monitors, Thomas watched the contractor teams finally withdraw, their carefully planned operation in shambles. They had come expecting to find an elderly veteran with outdated equipment. Instead, they had encountered a network that had spent 7 decades preparing for this moment. Margaret brought them both fresh drinks, her movements carrying the quiet efficiency that had made Murphy's Tavern such an effective hub for decades of covert operations. Some traditions, Thomas reflected, survived because they provided perfect cover for more important work. You know, Martinez said, studying her glass, when I first started investigating the rising tide, I never imagined it would lead to this. The trafficking operation was bad enough, but what was behind it? She paused, understanding the weight of secrets finally revealed. Some networks should have stayed buried. Thomas allowed himself a small smile, watching through his feeds as the final pieces fell into place. The night had exposed decades of corruption, rescued innocent lives, and protected the most crucial parts of the old network. Sometimes victory came not from direct confrontation, but from knowing exactly which secrets to reveal and which to preserve. "To quiet nights," he said, raising his glass. Martinez nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the toast. The world would never know the full story of what had happened in Newport, but the right truths had finally come to light. Through his earpiece, Marie's voice carried 7 decades of shared experience. "It's really over, Thomas. The network is secure, and the right people will face justice." In the comfortable darkness of Murphy's Tavern, Thomas Sullivan, veteran of countless covert operations, finally allowed himself to relax. Some battles were won not with weapons or tactics, but with patience, preparation, and the careful preservation of truth. Thank you for joining us for this thrilling tale of espionage, loyalty, and justice. If you enjoyed following Thomas Sullivan's story and the intricate web of secrets woven through Newport's quiet streets, please consider subscribing to catch more stories that blend historical depth with contemporary suspense. Each subscription helps support the creation of new stories that explore the hidden layers of history and the complex characters who shape it from the shadows. Stay tuned for more tales of covert operations, aging operatives, and the delicate balance between past and present. Remember, sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones that seem to hide in plain sight. Just like an elderly veteran sipping whiskey at his favorite tavern. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the next installment of stories that blend historical intrigue with modern-day suspense.